Oftentimes, the linguists and the project managers are almost treated as a commodity. And I've seen time and time again where you damage a customer relationship if they lose their favorite linguist or especially their favorite project manager.
This is big. If you have the two top players merging in a niche.
There are 100,000 dialogue files for a single Call of Duty title per language.
And welcome to SlaterPod 56.
Hello.
Hi there. How is life in London?
Swell.
Swell. All right. Well, it's swell here too. It's we got rain, on snow, on avalanche, on depending on the altitude you live. It's either nice powder or really wet avalanche or whatever it is out there right now. So
we actually had some snow at the weekend, Sunday, I think, in London. It didn't stick around though, unfortunately. There we go.
Never does. Never does. Today, we're going to talk to somebody who's based in a region of the world where there's a lot of rain too. In Seattle, we're talking to Mark Schreiner, Director of Business Development at AdaQuest, but also a language industry veteran and my former boss.
Aw.
So, yeah, looking forward to talking to my old boss, Mark Schreiner. We've done, we probably worked together around 5 years when I was with CLS out in Asia. That's more than a decade ago. Fun time, fun memories. But we're going to talk to Mark about all kinds of things, I assume. So, agenda today, mega deal in media localization. Then another media localizer, Sue Digital, exceeds expectations and investors are pleased. We're going to take a quick detour via GameLock to a new service that we learned about, but didn't really know what it was. In the 54 SlaterPod, the Supertext managing partner, Fabian Dietziger, teased that one. So let's talk a bit about that service. They launched it now. And then the acceptance of machine translation at the European Union rises. And there's one little example that I plucked out this week. In terms of what we have lined up in the event side, so Design Thinking, our workshop's almost sold out. I think we have literally like 2 tickets left. So register now. It's 3 days. And then, drum roll, SlaterCon Remote, Thursday, May 13th. Confirmed the date. Things are in progress. We started with agenda building and obviously some partners are onboarding right now. And we're doing 2 segments. So one for the kind of early morning Asia time zone and then one for Europe and mostly East Coast, but also the later part, the West Coast time zone. So it's going to be a really packed day. Cool. Esther, tell us about the mega deal in Media Luck.
Yes. Well, it's a heads up on a mega deal, I suppose, because it still needs to go through approvals and reviews. But this is the news this week that Media Group is going to acquire SDI Media, its large major rival in a consolidation play, really, of the media localization space. So some people might remember that IUNO merged with another large rival in the media localization space. That was BTI Studios back in 2019. They've always, well, not always, but they've pretty much been backed by SoftBank Ventures, I think, for a number of years now. IUNO, that is, and they also took on BTI's private equity backers, Shamrock Capital and Altor, in the BTI deal. But yeah, SDI Media is the largest media localization provider that features in the Slater Language Service Provider Index, and had revenues of about $215 million in 2019. So IUNO is going to be more than doubling, ideally, if those numbers have held, its revenues through the SDI Media deal. Yes.
So we're looking at roughly a $400 million company now.
Should be. Yeah, I mean, we did actually speak to SDI Media CEO Mark Howarth back in August about, his outlook for 2020, based on what he was seeing at the company. He gave us a bit of an update as well on how they'd been performing prior to when the pandemic hit. So he said in the 6 months to March 2020, which I realize is a bit out of date now, but They were 5% up on 2019. However, he said they were forecasting a 10 to 15% drop in localization revenues throughout the rest of 2020, so to 2020 year end or calendar year end. But they were forecasting a strong recovery in 2021. So yeah, it should be around 400 mil.
400 mil, yeah. So let's just talk about implications. So what I find interesting is when you have two companies of this size in a relative niche, it means that I mean, I don't know what's our estimate. I think we pegged the whole MediaLock at around 2.5, 3,
2.5, yeah,
2.5 billion.
Those lines,
so okay, they control roughly 20% of the market. No less. No, yeah, 20%. So. Because there is going to be client overlap, obviously, right? I mean, they're competing for similar accounts. So it means also that this particular niche, that the investors in Iono feel that there's not going to be too much risk in combining in terms of like, one of these big streaming platforms saying, hey, well, we don't want to source everything from you guys. If you're combining forces here, we're going to ditch you. So they're feeling that they can hold on to some of that work, and that generally it's a vote of confidence in the future of the space more generally, because they probably expect the pie to grow a lot. I mean, this is big. If you have the two top players merging in a niche, it's not like SDL and RWS, because that's a bigger pie. They're in many more different verticals, right? So this is very much consolidating. I mean, what's the next biggest media localization company?
Probably VSI, I think. I can't remember how much they're around, but probably VSI.
That's probably 4 times smaller. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think they're under 100.
Here. Significantly smaller. So just, I mean, there's a lot of consolidation, a lot of integration work upcoming. As they probably run on all kinds of different platforms, etc. So interesting. We should get one of their CEOs either on the pod or to join us at remote.
Definitely.
We don't have to go into detail, but this is complicated. Like I think, SDI was owned by a Japanese listed company called Imagica Group.
Majority owned. I don't think 100%.
Let's not go into the ownership. Whoever.
Let's not try and unpack it. But anyway, I think we should hopefully have some more information around financials when the deal actually closes. In the next month or so.
So this is a heads up. Interesting. So moving on to one of their key competitors that doesn't own a lot of physical assets but runs a successful cloud dubbing solution, media localizer Zoo Digital. What happened there? Seems things going well.
Pretty positive trading update. So Zoo Digital's financial year runs until March. End of March. So they're giving us a heads up, a forecast about what they are predicting for the full financial year. So they've said revenues of at least $38 million for 2021. This will be their full fiscal year 2021. And that is about, just less than 30%, about 28% growth from the previous year where they were just under $30 million in revenues. So ahead of expectations. I think obviously that's pleased it's pleased the markets and some of their investors. They are listed in the UK. I think you said that. But their shares have spiked. They spiked and peaked around on Wednesday of this week, dipped a little bit since, but they're still up around 44% year to date.
And the year is very, very young. So I just pulled up the chart on our real time ticker here on Slater.com, and it's up since mid-August. It's basically doubled. I mean, it came down a little bit, of course. Yeah. I mean,
they were actually flat over the year. So they were flat over 2020 pretty much, which, fair enough. But then
it was a big dip. There was a big dip, in March, like when everything collapsed, and then it rallied, but then kind of traded around 50. Now it's up 100. I mean, these are relatively thinly traded stocks. I would assume it's relatively. I mean, it's kind of a small cap, right? But still, I mean, let's see if they. Seems like investors are a bit more positive, and feel there's more growth. I mean, the solutions obviously, it's interesting, cloud dubbing, right? So. And moving away from media into an adjacent localization space is game localization. There was a pretty cool story we had there. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, kind of a short feature, I suppose, about game localization that we sourced after a gaming podcast had an interview with a developer of the popular video game Call of Duty. So they were talking about some of the localization activities and some of what goes into localizing a massively popular game like Call of Duty. It even, I think, sort of almost broke the internet, at least in the UK, around March when they they did a release of Call of Duty Warzone. But basically, the guy who I think was from Infinity Ward, which develops Call of Duty, was saying that so number one, each voice actor, so you have characters, the characters have voices. Each voice actor spends an average of 60 days in a recording session. That's quite a lot of hours recording. And there are 100,000 dialogue files for a single Call of Duty title per language. And Call of Duty is available in 10 languages. So that's 1 million dialogue files. Yeah. I mean, and this is something we talked about, I think, multiple times about media production, video gaming, all of these kind of multimedia, video-based things being really asset heavy. When we talk
really
about
heavy.
Asset heavy, this is, kind of blew me away, really, the scale of it, the sheer number of files. I think a lot of them would be short snippets because a lot of the time the characters just say like 1 or 2 words, but it's just a lot of files to be processing, managing, storing, archiving, whatever else.
I want to learn more about this.
There's one way to do that, which is to really get involved in playing the games.
I can't even go there. I can't go there.
Can't do it.
I mean, I could, but then I couldn't do podcasts anymore.
No.
I would be playing all night long. I shouldn't be doing it. So
but also, just in addition to that, so those are just the audio files for the dialogues, and obviously there's other things to localize within the game itself. So you've got the menus, and so you need subtitles for certain things as well. But that's I guess the audio is sort of a big part of it.
And then do they do some of this in-house? Do they outsource? Did they tell?
Yeah, they didn't really go into, because the interview was much broader than just localization, and we just happened to pick up on this. But I mean, I think we did a little bit of digging into Activision, which is the publisher of Call of Duty, and they have job adverts for sort of localization type people in Dublin. So they have at least some portion of sort of in-house expertise and management. But I'm sure that a lot gets outsourced as well.
Maybe some of it to Eltegram, to Marie. Remember? We should bring her back.
Yeah.
This is, just the scale of this is interesting. And, I think there was an earnings announcement by Keywords this morning. We're not talking about it. I think they didn't even mention localization anymore because there's so many other production component around this. But and also it's interesting that they would have voice actors for all of this. Like, to me, this would seem like, if anybody listens to that who's in that space, don't hate me, but like, wouldn't this be a good place for synthetic voices eventually? Because
well, I think
it's not like you're dubbing a human, right? I mean, you're dubbing a
character, but I think they want you want it to feel somewhat realistic when you go around shooting the different characters. I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, wouldn't as text to speech improves, and this is all becoming a lot more realistic and a lot more lifelike, then I mean, that would be an interesting first use case, given the enormity of this challenge here with those numbers of files, etc. Yeah.
So, I mean, Marie did say that they use synthetic voices, I think, on some of the tests. Like if you're sending a sort of prototype or something to the customer, or maybe I think she was saying something along those lines. It is used, it's just not used in the final versions.
Yeah, probably. Published. Sorry. I mean, any gamers, I guess I just underestimate the size of this industry generally, because to me it feels like there's some room to optimize. But if you're pushing out a game that has tens of millions of players, then probably that's just not the consideration. I mean, I guess you want to make it as good as possible. Cool. All right. That was Call of Duty, which, maybe I have a few more years until my sons are going to start gaming, so I'll keep them at bay for now. Hey, we had Fabian, Supertext managing partner, on the podcast 2 weeks ago, and he teased this announcement I think towards the end of the podcast about a new service they're launching, and he didn't want to tell us what it was. So there was a bit of a drum roll there, but now we know. And I just want to briefly mention this because I find it kind of interesting. So basically, they call it instant translation, which when I read it immediately, I thought, well, this is just some kind of chunk,
MT,
like chunk up little content bits, and MT, etc. But it's not really that. I think it's actually more they're connecting clients to translators that are online. So it's and then you can actually very much interactively work with that translator. So, hey, I have a question. I'm basically finishing up a press release, and I have a couple of questions around English terminology. Can you help me? Right. So you're chatting with an actual translator. I think this is it's kind of a nice service, and it's probably from like real life challenges, right? I mean, so you don't if you have anything to send for translation, you just kind of need somebody, an expert, to help you for 10, 20, 30 minutes. And, if you have enough translators on staff, then you can offer that service. So interesting. Cool. Good luck to Supertext. And another one, also PR that we ran this week, was a press release, was that Tilde ran a press release around, the headline was 50 million words translated. The German European Union Council presidency translator sets new record. So I dug into this, and the European Union has the rotating presidency, right? Every 6 months, a new country takes the presidency of the council. And in, I think the one second half of 2020 was Germany. So they had a website, European EU 2020.de for Germany. And so there is basically, so there's two stories to unpack here. First, there's the European Union Council Presidency Translator, which is actually an online machine translation portal, for lack of a better word, right? It's just like another like Google Translate type of website where you can punch in text, and it's powered by Tilde DeepL e-translation, which is the European Union's MT engine, and then the German AI Research Institute, DFKI. And the whole thing was financed by a grant from Germany's Federal Foreign Office. I don't actually know if that presidency MT translator was just for the German one, or if that's probably more of a recurring one, because now I think it's Portugal. Anyway, so the bigger point that I want to briefly mention here, the more interesting one, is that German website, the EU 2020.de, there was human translation for German, English, and French, but then all other remaining 21 languages had like a little, like a kind of a machine symbol. So those were purely machine translated. And, this is obviously an important website. I mean, it's the European Union, it's the presidency, it's really important things that are being discussed for, that concern literally hundreds of millions of people. And the fact that the European Union feels comfortable putting a website online that is for, 2/3 of the constituents there is MT. This is remarkable. I haven't seen this before. And, obviously there hasn't been any pushbacks. There hasn't been any clickbaity headlines yet. So it looks like everybody felt quite comfortable with that. So that's an interesting move towards kind of a broader acceptance of public-facing MT content by the European Union. And I think that's why it's relevant beyond, who did the MT. In this context was Tilde, but, interesting. So, yeah, I don't know. English, with the UK exiting, we're basically left with Ireland and Malta, and I don't know, is anybody else? So they did still take, they did considered German, English, and French as kind of the core of the core of the core. That's why they did them via human translation and the rest via MT. All right, enough of Europe. We shall head to the west coast of the United States and speak about Asia and other things with Mark Schreiner.
All right.
See you soon. Bye. And welcome back to Slated Pod 56 today with Mark Schreiner. Hi, Mark.
Hey, Florian. How are you?
Good. Where does this podcast
think
find
about that
today?
for a second. And hi, Esther. How are you?
Hi, welcome. Yeah, well, thank you.
Good.
Yeah, I had to think because it's, dude, it's dark, it's snowy. I guess where you are, it's dark and snowy too.
Exactly. Seattle, and you're in the Shire, so...
The Shire. All right, so Mark's an old friend, and he's worked in several roles in the language industry, and now, Mark, you're running North America sales for Adequest. But tell us a bit more about your background, what brought you into the language industry, and what are you doing now, and just a bit of a personal background, professional background, please.
Okay, so I had about, 10 years of executive level experience in Asia, all across Asia, various roles. And in 2008, CLS Communication, which is now CLS Communication Lionbridge, was recruiting for a CEO Asia Pacific. And I read the job description, and they were actually looking for somebody who had a lot of business development experience in Asia and somebody who had some turnaround experience. And I went through that job description. I still remember to this day. And I was like, every single thing on here aligned with some of the experiences and the skills that I had. So I reached out to CLS and went through this long, Swiss, torturous, highly analytical, involved recruitment process where they actually at one point sent me to Princeton, New Jersey for an on-site, one-on-one, mano-mano with a PhD in behavioral psychology just to kind of prod me and put me through all these different exercises. And eventually, amazingly, I convinced them that I was okay. And so ended up working with CLS. And that was really interesting because I was an outsider from the local industry, but I had the Asian experience and a lot of business experience. And coming in from the outside gave me kind of a unique perspective. I worked with CLS, and at CLS, I had the good fortune to work with you. And I think we did some really cool things out in Asia at that time that we can get into later if you like. And after 4 years at CLS, I moved to Japan. I did some consulting work with Gango. I also ran APAC for the Big Word for almost 2 years. Did a consulting project with We Localize, and also worked with Wordbee and helped them to kind of grow their North American sales. In fact, my oldest son still works for Wordbee, running their North American sales. So I've worked on the LSP side. I've worked on the cloud kind of side with what Gango was doing, and then also on the technology side. So it's kind of a unique thing. And now I'm with Adequest, which actually has deep roots in the localization industry. Hiro Machado, the CEO, used to work for Bound, worked for Lionbridge, used to have a couple hundred loc PMs on site at Microsoft, but now has shifted and pivoted into becoming a cybersecurity partner for Microsoft. And that's what I'm doing now. That was a really quick catch up.
That was a really quick catch up. Yeah. So, so you moved from, when we worked, you were in Singapore, and then you moved from Singapore to Japan, but you stayed quite a long time in Japan. Last time I think we met was in Tokyo like 3 years ago, but since then you've moved back to
at one of your
Seattle,
events.
Right?
So we moved back to Seattle in 2017. My oldest son was getting ready to start university. My second son wanted to play college soccer, and in order for him to get on the coach's radar, we needed to be back here. And my third son, which was the only one of my three boys that was actually born in the U.S., he'd left when he was like 2, so he didn't remember it. So I thought, it's a good time to come back to the States. And so we came back, and here we are.
Here you are. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now in, whatever lockdown you are in.
How severe is it in Oregon? Washington, we got hit hard right at the beginning. We had like one of the worst outbreaks was in the nursing homes here. But since then, the response has been pretty good. And it's interesting because I look at the numbers of various states. We have the same population here as Arizona, but Arizona has 3 times the cases, 3 times the deaths. Okay. And I was recently in Arizona, and I mean, you would see restaurants filled with people, nobody wearing masks. And they were just kind of like, it's not going to hit us. Arizona also has an older population in general because you have a lot of retirees who move there. And then I compare what's going on here with, for example, Japan. Japan has 130 million people. Washington State has 7 million people. and the cases and deaths are almost the same, which is,
Wow.
I mean, amazing. And people are pointing the finger at Japan because the numbers are going up, but they're nowhere near of what we're seeing here. What's going on where you're at? How is life in Zurich?
Well, Zurich's quite normalish, but I guess tell us a bit more about London, Esther. It's different there.
Well, we've just hit a bit of a dark milestone, which is 100,000 deaths, they think, from COVID. Not in London, obviously, but in the UK generally. So schools are staying closed. We're still pretty much in not quite full lockdown, but not far off. So it's looking quite bleak. But they are obviously rolling out the vaccine, as with other places.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an increasing amount of optimism. I would call it guarded optimism. One, because we don't know really how, what's the long-term result of the vaccine, and then we have these new strains, like the London strain, and who knows what's next, right? And so it's, but people are cautiously optimistic. In the States, we also went through this very torturous election process and electoral confirmation process, finally got a new president. And so I think the general sentiment feels like we're going in the right direction, but I think we've got a few more months to before we're out of the woods.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Let's see about, we're not planning. We're planning for SlateCon Remote, another installment of that. And I was just talking to Andrew today about like, hey, should we maybe anticipate like an in-person conference? But basically at this point in time, there's no point. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. And where would you have it? I guess that's a critical thing. I mean,
well, we were supposed to have a London one last year. So the very one that was scheduled in May 2020 was a London conference that got obviously postponed.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess in some ways the States might be the logical choice because people can travel inside the US. But when you talk about international travel, I mean, forget about going into, for example, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and I mean, are your borders locked down there?
Yeah, not here, but they won't let me go to the US.
We've got increasing.
Anyway,
that was increasing restrictions. Oh,
nothing at all to do with
on COVID. Yeah. No, we've
nothing
got
at all to do with
2 weeks in hotels. They're talking about bringing in like quarantine for 2 weeks in a hotel if you're coming back to the UK from a number of other places. That would not really be feasible for a conference, I don't think.
No. That's why we do it on Hopin. We signed up to, or we upgraded our Hopin account a couple of days ago. This is like the technology we've used last time. It's really cool. So there's more networking stuff we can do, more white labeling stuff. So it's looking quite good. We're doing our first workshop on design thinking in 3 weeks on that, and it's going to be great. Hey, so let's just. You're one of the. I mean, in this industry, generally, there's a lot of like industry lifers. I mean, I spent like in my professional, I guess, business career, I spent almost all of it in the language industry. I mean, I had a kind of prior career in construction, but I don't think that counts. But you've kind of jumped in and out of the language industry and went into like enterprise, software sales, etc. Just give us a little bit of perspective from the outside on this industry. What are some of the differences? Like, is it as niche as we sometimes think, or is it kind of up to speed on many things? Like, what's your take on that?
Well, yeah, I agree with you. There are a lot of lifers. In fact, I was talking with Renato one time, and we were talking specifically about that. And I made a comment that the local industry was kind of like the mafia and Hotel California all combined. I mean, you can check out, but you can never leave, right? I mean, it's just like you're in for life, right? And I got a laugh at the time. Hopefully it'll get one here, but it's interesting because I find in some ways the local industry is very entrepreneurial in the meaning or in the sense that you have a lot of mom and pop startups, family run businesses that grow and develop. But then I find at a certain level, some of the entrepreneurialism and the innovation maybe slows down. And my sense is that some of the larger players in the industry kind of lose sight of let's build a better mousetrap and find a better way to service our clients and just chase growth for the sake of growth. Okay. And so, and how do they grow? typically it's through acquisition. And the idea is, well, we'll buy this company and we'll bolt it on, and we'll buy this company and bolt it on. And it sometimes it seems that they're bolting on organizations just for the sake of making the whole ship bigger, but they're not making the end service to the customer any better. And that's ultimately what you have to be doing, either making your employee experience better or your customer experience better. Now, there are exceptions to that. There are some companies out there that are doing amazing things with organic growth, with innovation. When I talk about organic growth, I think TransPerfect has an amazing record of growing organically, right? And they've done it time and time again for so many years that it becomes part of their DNA, so that when they grow, they know the drill how to expand. Because that's another challenge with this industry is when you go get a new customer, you've got to get the project management team in place. You have to get the linguists in place. You have to get whatever technology or the tools in place. And so it's challenging to scale. But if you're continually growing organically, you've built that into your DNA and you can do that. But if you're just out acquiring companies, unless you're really good at bolting these on, it can be a challenge to scale. The other thing is not just the scale, it's the challenges. Where do you get the synergy? Okay, so we go out and we buy, I'm a US-based LSP, and we go buy a technology company. Well, does that make sense for us? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. We go buy an LSP in Spain. Are we going to share linguist? How are we going to make, instead of 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 1 = 3? Where do we get the synergy? And many times I've seen the acquisitions actually kind of fall short of not even 1 + 1 = 2, but maybe 1 + 1 = 1.5. And that's kind of disappointing. And then the 1.5 is from three different angles, looking at the financial bottom line. I mean, you can dig into some of the companies that are out there acquiring, you can look at their financial reports and you can see how profitable.
That's my hobby.
There you go, right?
That's my hobby.
You can see whether or not they're getting a lift from this. Their stock price might be getting a lift, but are their revenues or their gross margins getting a lift? Is their employee retention getting a lift? And oftentimes it's not. And so I guess that was a kind of a long-winded sort of half answer to your question, but I mean, I love the industry. Some of the nicest people I've ever met are in this industry. Some of the best people I've ever worked with, you included, are in this industry. I just do think that it is ripe for innovation. And let me just kind of tie that in, and I'll turn this back over to you. I think that if you're in this business, you should be asking yourself, what problem can we solve? Now, translating words from one language to another, that's not solving a problem. Everybody's doing that, okay? Adding on a translation memory or TMS, or even the whole workflow system, that's kind of just table stakes these days. You need to be looking at bigger problems, and when I say bigger problems, maybe that's security. For example, at CLS, one of our unique value propositions was the fact that we had a very secure platform, but we could also place our linguists on site 24/7 anywhere in Asia. Well, actually, we could do it anywhere in the world, right? And we also had some very unique domain expertise in the investment banking, equity research areas, etc. So those are kind of unique value propositions that are solving a problem. Does that make sense to you, what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, just maybe a quick follow-up in terms of the professionalism or the setup for, well, you were talking about like the difficulties to scale. When you're looking at some of these super fast growing kind of tech companies that maybe you have some insights on the enterprise side, like is there a structural difference when you look at these companies versus like an organically or bolt on LSP, or like, is it kind of comparable, or is there like, these fast growing SaaS businesses look completely different versus some of these LSP businesses?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, my take on that would be when any service industry is going to be more challenging to scale, okay? Because more customers, more projects means more staff. Many of the projects, even though that you can, much of the work, even though you can automate it, still requires people, okay? Whereas a lot of the SaaS-based companies out there, they've invested in their product, and they just need to make sure they've got enough server space to accommodate more subscribers in greater volume. And so that's kind of the inherent difference, and it's probably a simplification of your question. I do think it's challenging. One of the things that I think, I'm sorry, I should be letting you talk more. But one of
no, you're ready to talk, man.
One of the things that I feel that some of the companies in this industry could do a better job of is, since it's a service industry, the key people are the people. So project managers, linguists, and oftentimes the linguists and the project managers are almost treated as a commodity. And I've seen time and time again where you damage a customer relationship if they lose their favorite linguist, or especially their favorite project manager. You might think that the sales guy is important or gal is important. No, once the work starts, it's the project manager, and they are the ones that's holding the customer hand, solving all their problems. And that job is a really tough job, by the way. I mean, they're in the middle between everybody. They got the salesperson, the customer, the linguists, all coming at them. And I look at, a way to scale is to really develop a core solid team of project managers and linguists. And linguists can help you in many other ways, aside from just translation. I mean, they can mentor other linguists. They can help you with recruiting, with vetting, etc. And so I kind of see that as one of the kind of forgotten keys to this industry, and again, and that's just from my perspective with the companies that I've worked at. And they not all of them have neglected that, and some have done better jobs than others. But I think it is really important.
I've kind of been nodding along emphatically because I spent I spent 6 years working in project management and ops, so I feel very passionately, obviously, about the role of the project manager and also the role of the linguist as well. But I think, as perhaps the only one in this conversation who has not lived in Asia, it would be good to find out a bit more about, some of the unique challenges of Asia, and also recognizing that it's not one homogenous market. So, when we talk about Asia, how diverse is it? What are some of the differences that you're aware of when it comes to, the various markets and countries in Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just touched on one of the key challenges is that there is a perception that it is all just one market. And why and how is that a challenge? Well, when you're dealing with the mothership, and the mothership could be in Europe or they could be in the US, and they've got this perception, and they've been told that, oh, Asia is like this, or even at the country level, well, we've heard that in Japan it's like this, or it's very challenging, but they don't really have on-the-ground experience. That can lead to a lot of miscommunications, misunderstandings. I was really fortunate at CLS, and Florian, you can probably attest to this, that we had a senior leadership team, and I'll speak, very specifically, our CEO, Doris Albiser. She would come out to Asia 3 or 4 times a year and spend anywhere from a week to 2 weeks, and we would do nothing but go on 4 to 5 customer visits a day, and then team meetings in the evening. So she would get the perspective of the customers, the prospects, and the team in all of our locations across Asia. That is hugely important. And if you have people who are trying to manage Asia from an arm's distance on the other side of the planet, and in between you and them is their misperception or conception of what Asia means and what it means to do business out there, that can be a challenge. Now, if we wanted to turn it around and say, what are some of the challenges inside of Asia? I would say it depends on the market. I mean, for example, in China right now, retaining people is incredibly tough because the cost of living is going up so high, and everybody's just trying to get ahead. There isn't the sense of loyalty to companies as maybe there are in some other markets. On the business side in China, for example, it's very, very price sensitive, price competitive. And if you are an international LSP going into China, you better have a recruitment plan in place, a recruitment for linguists that it's going to allow you to recruit linguists that are price competitive to the competition. Or you better have one hell of a unique value proposition. At CLS, we didn't really have to cut our prices in China, but we were selling into a very niche market, and we were doing providing some very niche services. I mean, we had linguists working on site, like I said, and they were very, very focused and specialized in terms of their domain. But if you're out there translating for heavy equipment manufacturers in China, you're going to have a tough road to hoe. Now, in Japan, for example, the challenge could be that it takes some time to get business relationships going. People want to get to know you. The trust is incredibly important. They want to understand everything about your process. And of course, there are exceptions to that. And in fact, if you remind me, I'll tell you an amazing exception, a very funny story about a really big win that we had in Japan. Most of the time, it takes time. And when you go in there, you have to just try to get what I call a minimum viable project. Just give us something so that we can prove to you that we can do a good job, and then give us something a little bit more, and a little bit more. And then after a while, the floodgates open. And I've had, some tremendous successes in Japan. They take time. But the great thing about Japan is that once you have a customer and you take care of them, they're with you. They're not going to jump ship because somebody else is going to offer them a cent or 2 cent lower per word rate. They don't care about that. They care about, they trust you and you're going to get the job done. And I could go on to there's other markets as well. And I guess just to sum up, Esther, one of the biggest challenges is if I look at it from a non-Asian point of view, is knowing what's real and what's not real, because you will have people in different markets will tell you, well, in Singapore, it's like this. And you're coming at it from a multinational perspective, an international perspective, and you say, well, these are some global standards, and we work with these international companies in many different markets, and we think that this model might work here. And then you go to Hong Kong and you get the same argument. Well, in Hong Kong, we don't do it that way. And in Japan, we don't do it that way. And you have to be able to figure out what is real and what isn't. What's really going to work, and when do we impose our global standards, and when do we become a little bit flexible? Sometimes it's very, very clear you're not going to bend to the local standards. I mean, there are certain situations that borderline on customer rebates in borderline unethical manners, and you're like, we have nothing to do with that, right? That's not acceptable, even though that might be part of the local practice. So as a non-Asian company, or even if you're an Asian company doing business in other markets, you got to be able to sort out what's real and what's not. I mean, Florian, did you see any of that when you were out there?
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree that you have to really carefully assess, as you just said, like what is, like they're saying, oh, I can't just repeat what you're saying, but this is China. We do it very differently. This is mainland China. You can't do it that way. But well, sometimes you kind of have to pull back a little bit and say, well, but we're not a Chinese company, so we're going to have to do it our way, even if that means maybe X, Y, Z. But sometimes you have to bend a little bit and just tell the mothership, that's going back to what you said initially, that, well, this isn't Switzerland. It's not Zurich. This is Shanghai. I mean, you have to, BD meetings work differently, and maybe. But yeah, it's a challenge. I think it was a big challenge to manage the region, because Singapore is very different from Hong Kong, is very different from mainland China, and obviously Japan is its completely own, planet. So if you have regional teams, and if you're an LSP of any size, you're going to end up with regional teams very quickly, just because of the nature of the business. Managing something as diverse as Asia is just so different. And like sometimes I had to explain to people back, look, if I take a flight from Singapore to Beijing, it's literally as if I took a flight from Nigeria to, I don't know, London. Like that's the distance we're covering here. Like
it's not the same country, man.
It's not the same thing, So
can I just ask you both a question on that? I mean, if you are a North American or a European mothership type LSP, is it enough to have, if you want to gain a real foothold in Asia, is it enough to have, your one office in Hong Kong or your one office in Singapore to try and really break into the region? Or do you think you also need to have these kind of sales offices and more in the different countries?
Do you want me to go first, Florian? Okay, so I think it really depends on your business. If you already have existing multinational customers and they need service in Asia, you might try a couple countries at once. My preferred choice in most situations is pick one market, embed yourself there, and then start to use that as a base of operations to start expanding. Because if you go into, and this is something that CLS probably, it was a misstep in my opinion. That was before I joined, but if you go into Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai at once, you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. You're spread really, really thin, and you're almost at the mercy of a lot of different factors. And it can be very, very expensive really, really quickly. So if you can build some core expertise, say in Singapore, or let's just say Hong Kong. Maybe you're in financial printing or financial translation. You start in Hong Kong. Maybe the next logical step might be Shanghai, if that's your niche. But I would focus on one market. By the way, let me just add before Florian jumps in. If I were going to pick one market in all of Asia, I would pick Japan. Why? Because it's the second or third largest translation market in the world. It's about $2.2 billion. The largest company in Japan, largest translation company, only that would be Honyaku Center, only does about $100 million. So they have about 4 to 5% market share. Highly fragmented, not very well automated, relatively unsophisticated, high margins, and ripe for disruption. And that was one of the reasons that I moved to Japan, is I did and still believe that there's a huge opportunity there. Florian, over to you. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's challenging to set it up. So yeah, don't try to do all of it at once. Or if you try, maybe buy a company as opposed to try greenfield and just try to do it on your own. Because yeah, you're gonna spend a lot of time and money on it. But that said, once you actually have it, it's great to be in the actual, even in the city. I mean, I opened a small office in Beijing at the time because we had a lot of business from Beijing, but we serviced it from Shanghai. Actually, just to get closer to the decision makers, like literally closer, it helped a lot to actually open a small office in Beijing. So yeah, I think don't try. I think trying greenfield in multiple locations, for an LSP is tough. So maybe look at the acquisitions, and if you but do not just stay in one particular market. So yeah, I guess Japan is great. It's challenging to do Japan, but it's a much bigger market, kind of more domestic market. But I'm not very experienced in Japan. I've always struggled with the mental shift, like when you operate in China and then you go for some client visits to Japan. It was just the etiquette and the whole thing was just so challenging to it is
very much different. But you did bring up, I think, a really good point of acquisition is a very successful strategy. And I've seen the Big Word. That's how they got their start in Asia, with an acquisition. We Localize, a couple of different acquisitions, Japan and China, way back in the day. And I know that Straker right now has purchased a couple small companies. I don't know the history of Lionbridge. Lionbridge has a very large operation in Yokohama, and I don't know if that was an acquisition, but I'm assuming. And so I think that's a really good point right there. Can I just remind you, because you want to talk about the differences in business, and you mentioned about the business development person or the meeting, the dynamics in China versus, and then you just brought up Japan. And it's so fun sometimes to see the different cultures collide. And I don't know if you were in the meeting, but we had a meeting in the Shanghai office. Doris, our CEO, was there, and we had the Asia representative for a large German company. It was our first time for him to visit our office. And then we had one of our business development people from the Shanghai office. And now so for example, in Japan, for example, you never answer a phone when you're in a meeting, right? But I'm guessing, based upon the response of our German customer, that you don't do that in Germany or in Switzerland either. But do you remember? Were you there when our BDM's phone
picked it up? Yeah,
he picked it up, but then he talked, and then he put it down and it rang again, and then like all eyes went to him. And literally, there were laser beams from our customer looking at him like, what are you doing, right? And then it happened a third time. And that time I took him by the arm and I was like, I don't want to say his name, but I said, hey, why don't we take this outside? But so there, but that clash, I mean, you see that's kind of a big example, but you see it at all different levels all the time. And that's what actually is, in some ways, it's enjoyable. It's fun. It wasn't fun at the time, but
well, but that's also maybe just high performing salespeople tend to be well, I don't know what the right word is there, but like you gotta manage
focused.
them quite well. Yeah, focused, right? But also that aggressiveness and that helps in sales, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it maybe it's sometimes a little bit hard for PMs because like the sales performer will come in and like just get everybody hyped up. But I think for sales generally it helps. So maybe that generally for sales and BD in the language industry, like. What works? What's your take? You've managed a lot of sales teams outside and inside of the language industry. What do you think are some of the key things that you need to take care?
Okay, so it's funny.
You've written a book on sales, man. So
yeah, nobody ever read it, but so, I think it was a required reading for you, right? When we were working together, right?
Yeah.
Doris sent out a memo. So it's funny because somebody just asked me the other day, what would you do if you had a highly experienced Loc BDM who, been in the industry for many years, but was just continually underperforming? And I would say, unless they're highly coachable, probably say goodbye to them, because that's one of the things you see in the industry is people who, because they're lifers, and it is kind of I'd almost say like a Loc family vibe to the industry, and you see, BDMs move from one company to another, and do a couple of years here, and some of them do great, and some of them just kind of continually do about whatever. But you see some of that. Whereas if you're, America is really cutthroat, and Silicon Valley is right down the road here, and if you don't hit your quota, you might be out. You could have been the star for the last 3 years. You don't hit your quota, there's going to be blood on the sales floor, to steal somebody else's expression. So I see that our industry can be kind of forgiving. And then in terms of, I guess, advice or observations, I think if you don't have, well, sales is complicated. I mean, you could talk about proper targeting and building trust and, how to run a meeting and everything like that. But let's just say, I think a foundation for this industry is you have to have a very strong USP. Okay. Mm-hmm. And if you can't articulate that to yourself, you're not going to feel comfortable about going out, because then you're just out selling words. You have to have a very strong USP, that kind of, or unique selling point or unique value proposition that defines exactly what you can do and how you can help your potential customers in a unique manner that everybody else can't do. Because if you just go in there and say, hey, you know what, we have professional linguists and we've got a 2-step quality process, they'll be like, yeah, well, that's everybody else has that too. All right. But if you can go in and say, we've got some super unique technology that allows us to use freelancers, but doesn't allow them to download documents onto their computers or thumb drives. So they can do the translation, but they can't download the documents. So now you're solving a security problem, right? Or we can place people on site, or we have a partitioned, what do they call them when they're doing the IPO documents, where you've got the room? Yeah. What was that called?
Virtual data.
I don't know what it's called.
Well, yeah, the virtual data room, and then where you just throw everybody into an office and lock them down until the job's done, that kind of stuff, right? One of the, another strong USP for me is, can you do SEO optimized translation? And that started a few years ago and is becoming increasingly common. So maybe it's not such a strong USP right now, but if you don't mind, I'll tell you a quick story about how that actually helped me close, our team close a deal in Japan. First meeting with the customer for, I think it was about $120,000, $130,000. First meeting. Okay. So this American private equity company had purchased a chain of hotels, about 110 properties in Japan. And their primary market was Northeast Asia. So they wanted to go into Korean, Japanese, simplified Chinese, and traditional Chinese for Taiwan. And they were talking to a couple other translation vendors, local companies. I ended up getting an introduction and getting a meeting. And Fortunately, the company I was working with had just acquired a company that specialized in SEO content. So they were merging the two. And so this is one of the cases where 1 + 1 of an acquisition equals more than 2, it equals 3, because now you can offer SEO optimized translation with real SEO experts. And the CEO of that company that we acquired, I'll just call him Hugh because that's his name. He was visiting Tokyo, and right at the time I got the meeting. And so we went up there, and it was the most awesome meeting I've ever had in Japan. I took one of our senior Japanese PMs and I told him, this is an American private equity company. This meeting is going to go very, very quickly. We're not going to spend a lot of time introducing ourselves. I'll just give a quick introduction and then we'll start talking about their requirements. We sat down in the meeting and the key person wasn't there. His 2 colleagues were there. And I said, shall we wait for, let's call him Bob, to join? And they said, no, here's what we need. So, no introduction, anything like, here's what we need. And I said, well, we turned the conversation a bit to say, how important it is for you to drive traffic to these websites. Well, it's hugely important. And that was the key to opening up the SEO optimized part, right? Because that's what it's all about. And then Hugh took over the conversation. The key guy came in, and this conversation was like ping pong, back and forth, question, answer for an hour and a half. We walked out of there with an agreement that if we could do everything we said we could do, they would sign the deal the next week, and we got it. So that's an example of we're not just selling translation. If we were just selling translation, we would have probably lost the deal to one or two of those other local Japanese translation firms. But because we start talking about, do you want to drive traffic to the site? How do you measure conversions? What is a conversion worth to you? What's the cost of acquisition? If you have a repeat business, and Hugh, to his credit, could speak all of that language. I just shut up for like an hour and a half. I might asked a couple questions, but when you see real subject matter experts go into it, I've done my job. I've got the right people at the table, and they're not talking about translation anymore. So does that make sense to you?
Absolutely.
Let me ask you, because you know way more about this industry than I ever will, and Esther, you as well. What unique value propositions are you seeing out there? Some things that look cool. What types of what are companies doing that you're like, oh wow, that's not just translating words. That's something that's kind of cool.
That was going to be one of my questions to you, I'd say, in terms of, because you did articulate there, a couple of those of USPs that people can choose. I think Florian and I, we ran a sales and marketing webinar not so long ago, and we're talking about some of the different USPs.
You ran a sales and marketing webinar and you didn't invite me?
Sorry,
next time.
Oh, sorry.
But we were talking about some of the USPs that people can choose. I think the general advice was to focus, really. So if you want to choose a technology USP, go for a technology USP and really pursue it and make sure that everybody is comfortable articulating it. And if you want to pick a vertical or a couple of specific niche verticals, do that, but do it well, articulate it well. It by sales and also in your marketing material. It could be a geography USP as well, that you've just got super deep relationships in a particular geography that we talked about. So I don't necessarily think there's one's best, but it will be a question of evaluating where you are and where you want to get to as well. But so throwing it back to you, because you are the expert, I'm wanting to know, I think, from your perspective.
Flattery will get you nowhere, Esther. So
I won't bother.
No, what's the question?
No,
what's your question?
Yeah, no. So just looking, I think looking a bit more that as LSP and the language industry generally becomes more focused on providing technology and on using technology in operations, do you think there's a shift that needs to happen for salespeople to articulate that to customers, and what does that really involve for sales operations?
Yeah, you cut out a little bit there. So, but I think what you're saying, first off, I agree with exactly what you're saying about the USPs, and it doesn't have to be some amazing technology. It could be subject matter expertise in a particular vertical, certain geographic expertise, etc. I think that sales people, and I don't even like the word sales people. I mean, I prefer business development, but people say, well, business development means a whole other thing. Sales just sounds so cliche, but I think I like solution architect. I like customer success. Whatever your title is, if you're out there interacting with your customer, whether it's the first meeting, the second, or the 50th, you should always be looking to help them solve problems, bring value to the table. So, if they're using a CMS and they're translating and you're sending over files and they don't know about plugins that will allow them to, to just pull that content directly in, that's an opportunity to bring value to the table. That's the simplistic version. But I think there's always ways that we can bring value to the table. And if you continually do that, you're going to have a much stronger relationship with your customers, and they're going to trust you as an advisor. They're going to keep you around. If you're just selling them awards and your USP is that you're at 15 cents a word and the competition's at 16, well, guess what? The next guy in the door is going to go like, we're at 14 and 13, right? So you need to have a stronger USP. I got a question for you, Florian. What about these companies that, because I don't really have any expertise in this area at all, but the companies that focus, for example, in multimedia, because there's an explosion of web content, and you look at Netflix and all the other streaming providers out there. Do you see that as a sweet spot right now in the industry?
It's a sweet spot, but it's basically also, it's very contained, no longer little universe. It used to be more kind of, it's somewhat niche, small, but it's growing very quickly, but it's still very much contained. And I think it's super hard for an LSP to expand like organically into that. That's why, for example, TransPerfect, that never buys anything, bought dubbing studios and media production studios, right? Because it's just, you can't really build that expertise from scratch. I mean, you can, but it's just going to take you forever, right?
Right.
So it's very hard, but it's a great area, but also where the language component is less dominant. I mean, if you look at dubbing, right? I mean, basically the actual translation is a small part of the whole value add, but actually the performance of the voice artist and having the studio, or now having the SaaS software that does the cloud dubbing, etc., that is the big chunk of the work and the revenue, right? And it's very hard for, let's talk about salespeople again, or business developers. I mean, it's really practically impossible for you to go into a meeting with an investment bank and sell them a pitch book translation, and then like turn around and go to Netflix and talk to them about localizing a kids TV show. Like, it's just not possible. So because you need to obviously talk the language of your client. You need to be very much educated in the area you're selling it to. So this media business is very much self-contained, and I think it's an interesting one, but a challenging one to get into. And what you mentioned before, I think for me, one of the biggest challenges in sales in this industry is what you mentioned, but also what Esther mentioned. It's those niches. Like, you can't be an expert in everything. Like, right. I remember I ramped up on selling the IBD, like the investment banking stuff, then the private equity stuff. And then it took me like 2 years to understand how to sell to a pharmaceutical company. Like, what did I know about phase 1, 2, 3, preclinical, linguistic validation, all of that? That takes you forever. But if you sit in a meeting with these people and you don't know what phase 1 or 2 is, I remember a little anecdote, since we're sharing some anecdotes. We were once asked in a giant pitch if we could do PROs, and like the pharma client asked it, like
patient-related outcomes, PROs,
patient-reported outcomes, like, and outcomes. Literally no one knew what it was, and we were complete fools in that meeting. But
did you do the right thing and say, of course we can do those?
I don't think so, because that's where the Swissness comes in. Now, so probably we're very honest, like, well, I don't know what that really is. Anyway, so that is a huge challenge to like know all of these different verticals, like if you want to sell into, right? So you have to specialize a little bit. Okay, after that PRO disaster. No, let me just ask you another one, staying with the technology component of it. Like, we talked about Asia, but let's talk a bit about the US localization, SaaS. A lot of companies based in the US that do like localization software as a service. What's your take on where this is going? And just generally, since you're in Seattle, that's like the heart. You got Amazon, you got Microsoft, like the localization market, the tech localization market. Is that something you're still keeping a pulse on, and anything you can share about that?
I I think there's a couple different angles that are interesting. I'm curious how they're going to play out. And I'd actually like to, I'm going to turn this phone back over to you. I don't really have a horse in the race at this point, but I see as two competing models. You have the pure play technology companies, the WordBees, the MemSources, et cetera, out there, and then you have the smartlings who are selling services and technology. And I think TransPerfect and Lionbridge and SDL all kind of fall. You tell me if I'm wrong, but I think they all fall into that kind of camp. So they can provide both the tools and the technology. Now, if I were a large multinational company that was translating millions of words every year and I wanted a highly automated workflow, I am not sure I would want to go and buy technology and then go find a vendor. There is some freedom for doing that, though, because then I'm not locked into one vendor, right? That said, some of those companies that I mentioned as doing both translation and having their own tools do allow for multi-vendor access, right? So it's going to be interesting to me because I think there's a pretty big paradigm difference there in which one is the real end play. Right now, I mean, if we look at the pure technology companies, none of them come even close to the size, volume, or anything to the large LSPs. I mean, you know the numbers obviously way better than me, but I'd be surprised if there's a technology company out there, a pure play technology company in the loc space that's doing 15 mil a year. I think that's probably the upper end. I don't know. I mean, you tell me if there's something
I
higher.
think MemSource now with the acquisition, they're probably getting to 15, 20. So that's the upper end.
You're right. And that is nothing. And so what does that mean in terms of resources and the ability to expand, right? And what's their upside? If you take MemSource and their acquisition and you take the next 10 companies combined and throw them all together, and assuming that they don't lose anything and they're able to leverage each other's technology or just inherit those customers, what are you talking about? 50 mil, something like that? So I think the real upside, as I see it right now, isn't really on the technology. It's on the blending of technology and services. Now, what happens when everything's being translated by AI? And that's a whole nother conversation. And I don't know where that's going to go. Obviously, that's a whole other conversation. But now, I see those two paradigms competing against each other. And I kind of feel that the blended approach has the most potential to grow at this point. What do you see? And I know you kind of be in your role. You kind of got to walk a straight line, and because because of your position in the industry. I don't think that you can come down too heavily on one side or the other, but what do you see? Or maybe Esther, you can tell us what you see.
Yeah, sorry, we had a bit of a hiccup there with the sound, but I think now we're back.
Yeah.
And so, I agree. There's basically a bit of there's competition, and I think it's actually, in terms of size, yes, the service providers are much larger, but in terms of the attractiveness of the revenue, as it were, is probably, you want to have more SaaS and tech revenue, right? That's why these companies are valued at a multiple of revenue. I think that some of the bigger and growing tech companies are increasingly very deeply embedded with the big accounts, and that's a real threat to the LSPs. They used to kind of really own the account and use the tool, and now kind of the tool increasingly owns the account and the tool uses the service provider, right? So there is quite a big battle of the giants going on there. So I agree. So hey, let me close on a question. So are you missing the language industry yet?
I miss you guys. No, like I said,
I back.
I always take nothing off the table, and if the opportunity were right and appropriate, I'd love to be back. I like I said, I've worked in a variety of different industries, and the one thing I do like about this industry is it does have a bit of a family vibe. And family can be good. Sometimes you want to kick your brother out of the house, but you don't want him to go too far away. You know what I mean? So I do like the industry. The people are super nice, and if you think about it, the core of this industry, as I mentioned earlier, is really it is your project managers and your linguists. A lot of the companies were founded by linguists who said, hey, you know what? We can scale this, but these are people who got into the industry because of a love of languages or travel or, internationalism or an international outlook. And that kind of fits or aligns quite well with my own interests as well. So I really do like the industry. I'm assuming you do as well.
I do. I'm on a meta level now. So I'm like, that's all I do. All right, Mark, it was great to catch up. And, maybe next time in Tokyo again.
Fingers are crossed. Florian, it was great seeing you. Esther, it was great talking to you as well.
You.
Wish you guys the best in 2021.
Likewise.
Take care, guys.
All right, thanks.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.